Fyodor Dostoyevsky was born in Moscow in 1821, the second child of 8 children. At home, Dostoyevsky was often told fairy tales, old Russian legends, and the Bible by his mother. These stories, Dostoyevsky later said, influenced his writing and awakened his imagination. Dostoyevsky's father, Mikhail, was a doctor who worked in a hospital for the poor. From a young age, Dostoyevsky encountered and befriended the poor while he played in the hospital gardens where his father worked. Later in his life, when he went to school in his teens, he found himself on the other side of the social sphere, ostracized from his more aristocratic peers. As a boy, his friends and playmates would often be the patients that his father looked after. He quickly learned of the afflictions of the impoverished. Often, we'll see characters in Dostoyevsky's work who are utterly loathsome and detestable. Friedrich, for example, in Crime and Punishment. And because of the way that Dostoyevsky writes, because he tries to give what he considers to be the worst ideas and the worst actions to sometimes the smartest, most articulate characters, there's often some confusion by readers that Dostoyevsky is in some ways condoning the actions of these heinous characters. Famously, a chapter from The Devils was censored for years because of the disturbing behavior that it described. But he would write so exactly and with such detail because he believed that it was essential to understanding the psychology of these men who had done horrible things. And only by giving a truthful and strong argument for why they are the way that they are would one be able to properly argue against them. Unfortunately, some of the inspiration for these types of characters would come to Dostoyevsky when he was only 9 years old. The addictions that would be commonplace in the poor and the violence that would often ensue as a result, sometimes to the most innocent members of society, including children his own age, would haunt Dostoyevsky for the rest of his life. He was the one who discovered the body of a girl his same age. She was a playmate of his who had been killed by a drunkard. He later stated, while recalling the event, "Taking life is terrible, but taking away faith in the beauty of love is an even worse crime." At 15, Dostoyevsky's mother died of tuberculosis. 2 years later, while going to school to be a military engineer, Fyodor learned that his father had died unexpectedly and mysteriously. After the death of his mother, his father had become a recluse. His fits of anger, previously directed towards his wife and children, would eventually be turned against his serfs. His father's official cause of death was a stroke, but rumors spread quickly that it was his peasants who had killed him out of revenge for their abuse. There was never a trial. Sigmund Freud later noted that Dostoyevsky's first seizure coincided with the death of his father. This first seizure would be the first indication of his lifelong battle against epilepsy. Dostoyevsky eventually retired from military service, fearing that it would prohibit him from expanding his work as an author. Dostoyevsky continued writing and successfully publishing novels and short stories. It was around this time Dostoyevsky began participating in a radical literary intellectual discussion group that was critical of Tsarist Russia. The group that he joined discussed banned books, interestingly, the problems of Russian serfdom, new ideas about abolishing marriage and private property, and some members even discussed revolution. Now, this was 70 years before the downfall of the Russian monarchy and the Bolshevik Revolution. But these ideas and these whispers against the government went back to that time of Dostoevsky. The government feared a revolution, and it wasn't until major changes in society and the First World War that a true socialist revolution was able to occur in Russia. Nicholas I, the Tsar at the time, had seen what had happened in places like France, that a king could be dethroned and killed. He believed in Russia taking an extraordinarily strong stance against any group that was critical of the monarchy and pro-revolution. Dostoevsky and the other members of the group were arrested in 1849 and sentenced to death by firing squad. It was at 7 a.m. Dostoevsky looked at the morning sun and said, "In 5 minutes, I will be where the source of all that light is." While the gunmen's fingers rested on their triggers, a messenger rode in, waving a white flag, holding a letter from the Tsar. It stated that he had decided to show mercy, that the men would instead be sent to a Siberian prison camp for 4 years, and then to military service for another 6. This wasn't actually mercy. This was a tactic used by Russian military to inspire both fear and gratitude in the prisoners who they did this to. He was permitted to only be able to read the Bible in prison and was not going to be able to write. He penned before going, "If I won't be able to write, I'll perish. Better 15 years of imprisonment and a pen in the hand." Dostoevsky later wrote of his time in prison, "In summer, intolerable closeness. In winter, unendurable cold. All the floors were rotten, filth on the floors an inch thick. One could slip and fall. We were packed like fish in a barrel. There was no room to turn around. From dusk to dawn, it was impossible not to behave like pigs. Fleas, lice, and black beetles by the bushel." It was said in the winter that the ice in the room would never melt, that their feet would actually freeze, that if one man stood up to walk to the other side of the room, his chains would often get entangled and tied together with the chains of another man. Dostoevsky's own hands were bound and shackled for the entirety of the 4 years, about 95% of the day. After his time as a prisoner, he was still sentenced to 6 years of exile on the Mongolian border. When Dostoyevsky finally was released, he was a different man. But he returned to a Russia that had in many ways changed even more than he had. The progressive ideas that Dostoyevsky had flirted with in his youth had been taken and amplified by the next generation of intellectuals. Gone and going were ideals of conservatism and religion. These intellectuals melded ideas from the French, the German, and the English, combining materialism, humanism, and utilitarianism into the distinctly Russian nihilism. The Russian nihilist movement advocated for the end of belief and trust in the current Russian authority, and particularly in moving away from a belief in religion and God to be replaced by something new. A quick digression. Holding similar views and with some remarkable parallels to Dostoyevsky was the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who famously wrote, "God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off of us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement with sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods, simply to appear worthy of it?" When we look at the complete quote by Nietzsche, it doesn't seem too joyous. In fact, it seems fairly mournful and fairly fearful. Nietzsche hoped that man could rise above his current position and past and be able to create a new morality, that man could essentially become God. Related to this was Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, or the Superman. Now, before Nietzsche, Dostoyevsky was talking about the extraordinary man, which was sort of a precursor to Nietzsche's Übermensch. And this was something that was being discussed in Russia by these young radicals, these young progressive thinkers, these young intellectuals. Dostoyevsky saw this new atheist movement as being incredibly dangerous. His fears would lay the seeds of inspiration for the protagonist of his novel Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov, a young man with his own Superman beliefs. Through the character of Raskolnikov, Dostoyevsky could explore what he believed would happen when a man tried to create his own values. Years later, we saw some of what Dostoyevsky feared come to being. Marxist-Leninist atheism, the official state ideology of the Soviet Union, was predicated on the idea that you could never have a socialist communist state without first having a largely atheist population. And part of the reason why that is because to have such faith in a government, in a state that promises peace, bread, and land, you have to have a population that believed human utopia was possible, and specifically that it was possible to create a perfect human state, a perfect society without God. Religious people don't believe that. And part of the reason that religious people don't believe that is because they've seen it not work in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament. Civilizations that come to power without God become corrupt and fall into chaos. Dostoevsky believed that as well. He believed that a society that tries to create a perfect state without God would lead to a society of fascism and totalitarianism. In Dostoevsky's The Devils, a character states, "I got entangled in my own data, and my conclusion directly contradicts the original idea from which I start. From unlimited freedom, I conclude with unlimited despotism." It's not that people who want utopia are bad. Again, Dostoevsky at least entertained some of those same thoughts when he was younger. The problem, Dostoevsky would say, is that people cannot create their own values, that human nature is ordered in a certain way that cannot be broken. To put into a psychiatric context, Carl Jung noticed a similar thing in many of his patients. Carl Jung once related a story of a young woman, a patient of his who had, during a state of depression, knowingly allowed her child to drink from a toxic water stream and die. The woman then became psychotic to the point of not being able to exist in normal life, having difficulty telling the difference between reality and fantasy. She was eventually institutionalized. Jung attempted something very risky in his treatment of her, which was telling her that she indeed was a murderer, that she had killed her child. The other doctors wouldn't tell her this, fearing it would make her psychotic state worse. But strangely, it did the exact opposite. After being confronted with the truth, the psychosis that she had diminished, and she was actually able to become mentally stable again and return to society in some capacity. Jung believed that murder was such a heinous crime that even if we didn't know we had done it, we would know we had done it. Even if this happened in a state of psychosis, or if we were somehow able to convince ourselves that it wasn't murder, nature itself would tell us that we had done something wrong. Jung believed that murder killed the soul, and the only way to rejoin society is to first admit that you have done something wrong. Now, taking this idea and these beliefs from one man, Raskolnikov, and applying it to a collection of people, that's what Dostoevsky feared. Interestingly, both the writings of Nietzsche and Dostoevsky would prove to be prophetic about the rise of totalitarian regimes in the 20th century. After writing an apology letter to the government, Dostoevsky was finally allowed to publish his writing again. He was, however, under government observation for the rest of his life. Dostoyevsky continued writing, got married, and began a stubborn addiction to gambling. He published an autobiographical novel titled Memoirs from the House of the Dead about his time in prison. In 1864, both his wife and brother died. Dostoyevsky became a single father to his stepson and the sole supporter of his brother's family. Dostoyevsky also took up the debts of his brother's failing magazine. Now, Dostoyevsky was already deeply in debt due to his gambling at this point. It wasn't long before debtors started knocking at his door, letting him know that either he find a way to pay these debts or be ready to go back to prison. It was around this time that his publisher, a man named Fyodor Dostoyevsky, came up with a deal to buy the rights to a collection of Dostoyevsky's works. Dostoyevsky reluctantly agreed. According to the deal, Dostoyevsky would also have to write a new 175-page novel in a year, or would lose the rights to all of his works that he had written forever. This was apparently a common tactic of this publisher, bullying struggling artists into relinquishing the rights to their work. Dostoyevsky was angry when he found this out, but the contract was signed, and considering the situation that he was in, it wasn't that bad of a deal. Especially considering that him being a Russian novelist and him being Dostoyevsky, writing a 175-page novel in a year wouldn't prove to be that much of a problem. So he tells Dostoyevsky he'll write this book and it'll be about and titled The Gambler. And from that point he had 12 months to write the book. Cut to 11 months later, Dostoyevsky hasn't written anything yet. At least nothing about The Gambler. He hasn't written anything about The Gambler because he's become fixated on this sprawling story of a lost young man who has become obsessed with the idea of being an Übermensch, of being an extraordinary man. But he can't turn that book in. And he doesn't have another book. And at this point, he has only a month to write his next book. Side note, his family and friends at this point even offer to kind of ghostwrite the book for him, essentially telling him, Dostoyevsky, why don't you come up with the story and we'll each write a chapter and then you can kind of clean up our writing a little bit. And he tells them no, because that would be dishonest. Maybe he also told them no because he didn't trust their ability to write. So he now has 4 weeks to write a book. If not, he loses his works forever and will very likely be going back to prison. Oh, and on top of all this, his epilepsy is getting much worse. To write this novel as quickly as possible, there was one hope for Dostoyevsky, which was in a brand new innovation called stenography. Very quickly, stenography is a way to write as quickly as a person can speak. At this time, what that meant was the use of symbols that the stenographer would write that could later be transcribed into long-form handwriting. Part of what this incredibly technical work does is increase the writing speed of a person. To put into perspective, today the average typist can type around 60 words per minute, while the average person speaks about 180 words per minute. Stenography helps the writer to match how quickly a person is speaking. But again, brand new invention. When Dostoyevsky asked a professor who taught stenography to recommend a student who'd mastered it, the professor didn't have many he could choose from. In fact, of the 150 students who were in the class, only 25 of them had not dropped out. Arriving as stenographer was a woman named Anna. For the next 26 days, Dostoyevsky would dictate, and Anna would write the novel. And miraculously, it worked. He had written an entire novel in less than 1 month. His livelihood was safe, his debt paid off, and the risk of imprisonment was gone. So successful was this partnership that Dostoyevsky asked Anna if she would be willing to help him finish his next novel, the one called Crime and Punishment. She said yes, and they began work on finishing that novel. Perhaps inspired by the relationship between that novel's characters of Sonya and Raskolnikov, Dostoyevsky asked Anna a question under the guise of gaining insight into the psychology of women. But it was, in actuality, a way of revealing his own romantic feelings for her. They would go on to be married and have 4 children. Crime and Punishment was released and became a critical and financial success, and is now known as the first of Dostoyevsky's 4 great novels. This, unfortunately, wasn't happily ever after for the Dostoyevskys. Fyodor's gambling addiction would again come back, and of the 4 children, 2 of them would die in childhood. His first daughter, Sonya, died at the age of 3 months of pneumonia, and his son, Alexei, died when he was 3 years old of epilepsy. Dostoyevsky even lost the family's entire wealth, again gambling. But this time it was Anna who reclaimed their wealth. She researched book distribution, retailers, delivery models, and made Fyodor not only successful once again, but a national icon and brand. Dostoyevsky became Russia's first self-published author, and Anna became one of Russia's first great businesswomen. She later went on to become a memoirist. Dostoyevsky hoped his writing would resonate in generations to come. He believed that this was the true purpose of a writer. Beyond fame and popularity, the role of a writer was to touch the souls of readers long after they were gone. He once wrote, "The mere thought that through one's inspiration there will one day lift itself from the dust to heaven's heights some noble, beautiful soul. The thought that those lines over which one has wept are consecrated as by a heavenly right through one's inspiration, and that over them the coming generations will weep in echo. That thought, I am convinced, has come to many a poet in the very moment of his highest creative rapture." Dostoyevsky would die of epilepsy 14 years after his marriage to Anna. So I just wanted to finish with one last quote. We started this year with Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and I think this quote ties very strongly into that book and that book's themes. And it's a good way to come full circle in the class. I think it's also important to finish a biography about Dostoevsky in this way because it's important to know how he would look at his life and to realize that despite all of the difficulty that he faced, that this is what he would think about when he thought about life. He would think about that time when it was 7 a.m. and for 40 minutes he thought, believed, knew that he would be executed. And then suddenly he was given a second chance. When I look back at the past and think how much time was spent in vain, how much of it was lost in delusions, in errors, in idleness, in the inability to live, how I failed to value it, how many times I sinned against my heart and spirit, then my heart contracts in pain. Life is a gift. Life is happiness. Each moment could have been an eternity of happiness.